afternoon, everyone. It's time for the Tech Talk show this afternoon. And today on the show, we're going to be talking about automation options in Azure. And with me on today's episode, we have Cameron Fuller. Good afternoon, Cameron.
Good afternoon, Kazim. How's your day going so far?
Very well, very good. So you're very much welcome on the show today, Cameron.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to get a chance to chat with you, and glad to see that you were speaking with some of my good friends like Sammy.
Quickly, people would like to meet you, so let's quickly meet you, know who you are, and then we can delve straight into our business of the day.
Absolutely. So my name is Cameron Fuller. I'm a solution director at Catapult Systems, and I focus on managed automation. And I've been a cloud and data center management MVP now for the last 14 years.
The first question is this, Cameron. What options are available to us for automation on Azure? Can you walk us through that real quick?
Absolutely. It's interesting. To use an analogy, is there are so many options available, it almost becomes like a Swiss Army knife. And the challenge is that at least my inherent nature and most of the people that I know, you get used to one tool and you start thinking about where everything looks like a nail when you're used to using a hammer, right? But the problem is there's so many different ones out there. So you've got things like DevOps and Deployment Manager and Blueprints, DSC, you've got Azure Policy, Resource Manager, Azure Automation, Azure Functions, Logic Apps, and Flow, also now known as Power Automate. So all said and done, there's almost a dozen different tools that do some form of automation in Azure at this point in time.
Let's begin with Azure Automation. Now you mentioned Azure Automation. So how does this really work? And can we compare Azure Automation with the likes of Puppet and Chef, or do we want to compare it to SCCM?
It's a really good question. So let's start with what Azure Automation is. So for those people who are familiar with System Center Orchestrator, or originally Opalus before that, they had this idea of a runbook, and this runbook was a PowerShell script basically that you would write, or a graphical runbook that would go do something in your environment. So what Orchestrator was is kind of the evolution before Azure Automation. So Azure Automation, you still have runbooks. They're still written in PowerShell, or they can also be written in Python. And you can pretty much just run those scripts up in Azure or run them on-prem through what's called an Azure Hybrid Runbook Worker. So you get the same functionality that you had when you were doing something like System Center Orchestrator, but you get it completely cloud-based. You don't have to build all the infrastructure that was required to be able to run it on-prem. You can use Azure Automation for just about anything. And that's actually where my challenge with the hammer and the nail comes from, because Azure Automation was first. So that's what I'm used to using. So everything that we write, we instinctively want to go to Azure Automation. But you brought up a great extra example, one that I hadn't even listed. So what about System Center Configuration Manager? Well, it does patch management, and it can deploy software, and it can do all these other things that are really, if you think about it, they're automation as well. So that's another tool that fits into the set. And that's where some of the challenge comes together, is to try to figure out, what do you use and where? We start talking about Puppet and things like that. I will admit it's not an area that I have that much skill with. I tend to work specifically within the Microsoft space. But most of what I see in that space is when people are working outside of the Microsoft spectrum, and that's what they're used to. But within our little example of how we use automation, Azure Automation has been our primary tool in terms of what we use on a day-by-day basis. I mean, as an example, the scripts that we run, or the automations that we run, we're averaging about 1.5 million automation runs a year, and all of that is in Azure Automation right now.
So talking about the Azure Automation now, with PowerShell, there are different go-to places that we can pick up PowerShell scripts that we can use on the fly. So can we also do the same for runbooks? Are there places we can go to also download our runbooks that we can just use on the fly? Does it work just like PowerShell does?
It literally works just like PowerShell does. So if you have PowerShell scripts that you want to run, it's literally as simple as transferring those over. So any sources that you would have used originally to get PowerShell scripts from or to build from, it's really the exact same thing. You're just putting those PowerShell scripts into a runbook that's actually stored in Azure itself. And you can even do testing off of like PowerShell ICE, ISE and things like that, run them locally on your systems to validate and then have them execute in Azure, or have them again execute on-prem on specific systems that you want them to run on.
So for the Azure, you mentioned now that the Azure Automation uses runbook. What's the difference? Sometimes people get it really confused. What's the difference between a runbook and a job?
So a job is an execution of a runbook. So anytime you run a runbook, it's a job execution that occurred at that point in time. So as a matter of fact, if you want me to do a quick screen share and we'll take a quick look at Azure Automation?
Okay, very well then. That's very well.
All right, so 1 second while I get things set up for that. All right, so we'll take a quick look. Here's a series of different Azure Automation accounts that are out here. So an automation account is what we're talking about when we're talking about Azure Automation. And I'll go ahead and grab one of our development environments as an example and show you around and see what this looks like. So we were talking about jobs. So these are job statistics, the jobs that have run, how many completed and how many have stopped. So it's quick and easy for you to be able to graphically identify, so 84% of my jobs were successful. And then if I scroll down through our process automation side here, I can see, well, what jobs have executed. And it's going to show me the different executions that occurred. So this is just a sample test module, when they ran, when they updated, and they do a beautiful job with the details on this. So you get all of the details of what parameters are used, where they're at, and all of that. So it's all native to Azure Automation itself. So you get great logging, and then you have the ability to run different runbooks like we talked about. And these are just different modules that have been added that are PowerShell. So I can just add a runbook or even import a runbook from outside or browse them from the gallery. So I'll take a quick look at the gallery here. So, Microsoft has done a great job with giving you pre-built scripts. Hey, I want to start an Azure V2 VM or stop one or stop schedules and things like this. So these are all just existing solutions that are out here in the gallery that you can go ahead and add and start using immediately within your environment. So they've done a really good job of making that easy to do. And then in addition, they've also made it very easy for you to just onboard a new script. So if I want to just go to a runbook, I can go ahead and just create a runbook. Call it the name that I want, specify 3 different types. I mentioned PowerShell and Python 2. There's also a graphical runbook, which is kind of also what we're used to within Orchestrator. PowerShell workflow and graphical PowerShell workflow, not exactly legacy at this point, but a little bit older, and plenty of different ways we can run things. And then I also mentioned you can run jobs on-prem. That's done through what's called this hybrid worker group. So these hybrid workers are just a couple of VMs or 1 or more VMs that you have in your environment that actually communicate with Azure. They reach out to Azure and say, hey, do you have something for me to do? And then they'll run those jobs and they send back all the information in terms of what they've done out there. So it's a very robust system here. You've got the ability to set schedules. You can define your modules so that a runbook that has PowerShell can call a whole bunch of underlying modules so you can reuse your code. So it's really an extraordinarily robust system for automation. Is there anything in here specifically you'd like to see, Kazim, that we haven't gone into yet?
Maybe not at the moment yet. So once we're done with a few of the questions now, so if you'd like to show us, it's your call now, to walk us through a few of those things. We're learning from you now.
Okay. Well, great. Let me show just a couple of other quick things that I think are really helpful. So first is credentials.
Okay.
This is how you store credentials within the environment. You can actually define who you want to have credentials, etc. In addition to that, you can set different connections to different systems and all of that So there's great stuff here. And then finally, this also ties into the alert systems. So within the alerts, we can actually define, so if something goes wrong within a run book or within an environment, I can run a run book to go do something about this. Let's take an old school monitoring one, like I'm running out of disk space. So what happens if I'm running out of disk space? Well, then I can have a run book, or an alert that notifies me that it occurred, or I can even have an alert that runs a script through a run book, which helps to clean up the drive space condition. So you get a lot of options there. And then one other piece here, just to show you an example, since this is kind of a different world, we have different ways of visualizing the data. So this is a sample dashboard to show you what it looks like. So I can actually see the different types of jobs that I'm running within this environment. I can see their breakdowns, the nice little donut charts and things like this telling me how many successful or unsuccessful and any problems that occurred and things of that nature. So it's a little different than what we were used to on-prem, but it's a phenomenally robust tool that really gives you a lot of power.
Okay. So how about pricing now, Cameron? How do we, since this is a cloud-based service, you want to walk us through how billing works with this particular service with Azure Automation? Absolutely.
So the pricing is based upon how much you use it, which is very common within the cloud model at this point. I think you get, I'm doing this from memory, but I think you get 500 minutes free of execution in Azure Automation, and then you're charged at like 0.002 cents per minute for the duration that the job is running. So in essence, your execution time, how much automation you're running, determines what your bill looks like. Azure Automation, like I said, we use it all over the place. I have found it to be extremely cost effective. It is, as an example, significantly less expensive than just running a virtual machine in Azure, as an example.
Okay. How about serverless automation now? You just mentioned that it's cheaper than running a VM in the cloud. So how about the serverless automation option? How does serverless automation option differs from the Azure automation itself?
Yeah, so the serverless approach is primarily within Azure Functions, and Azure Functions is extraordinarily powerful as well. It's a relatively new player in this area, at least from the PowerShell perspective. So it allows you to be able to run, as you said, serverless type configurations, very similar in approach to what they're doing within Azure Automation. But it seems to me, as a systems person, Azure Automation was more intuitive to me. From what I hear, developers tend much towards the Azure Functions because that feels much more familiar to them and to their experiences. Functions are also based upon usage, but they have some interesting capabilities that you don't get within Azure Automation. So as an example, let's say you're running a function that is going to, say, run an API. Well, then you can define a threshold and say, okay, I want to run this many nodes within normal execution. And then when I reach certain thresholds, I want to scale that up further automatically and even pre-scale it if I feel like the numbers are going to get too high. So it can scale up and scale down depending upon the load extremely fast. And now that it has full PowerShell support in addition to the stuff that it already supported, it's a pretty robust option, and financially, it's actually less expensive on a per time frame basis than it is to use Azure Automation.
In addition to this automation platforms that we've talked about now, I also know there are a number of unique automation options that comes with resources themselves, like VM, app services, databases. So can this be used in combination with the automation platforms, or would you say what's the best practice? Being the pro here now, how do we use this together?
That's where a lot of the biggest challenges are at, and I'll show you. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to show you a slide. I hadn't planned on that, but let me go ahead and show you a slide for a second because it kind of summarizes Microsoft's perspective on this. Because we had We had a discussion on this recently in terms of, how do you know which one to use and what are they good at and all that type of stuff. And it really depends upon what you're trying to do. So one sec while I switch that in. All right, would you let me know if that's visible?
Okay, it's up now, yes.
All right, so here's how Microsoft envisions this. So, you get the good question of, well, which do I use and where? There's stuff available everywhere. It depends on what your use case is. So what they're recommending, and I agree with them, is you use the tools that were built for that particular area. So we'll start here on the left with deploy. So if you're deploying things into Azure, you're looking at DevOps, Deployment Manager, and Blueprints. You could do any of these things in Azure Automation, Azure Functions, and the rest, but you would basically be recreating and then maintaining the wheel that you had to recreate. So there's existing tools there for deployment. Those are great things to be able to use. The second bucket they talk about is this concept of responding. So something happened. That low disk space condition that I mentioned before, or a situation of maybe a high processor or a service that's not responding properly, that's where you get some other built-in capabilities around DSC, or assigning policies or capabilities within Resource Manager. Those are kind of core in there. And then that's where Azure Automation ties in as well, because as we can find issues with any Azure resource. So if there's a problem with an Azure, say database you mentioned, okay? So we have a situation where a database is non-responsive. Well, we can have an alert which calls Azure Automation or a function or a logic app that will go do something about that. So we do that as an example. So we have a situation where when we're doing monitoring, we watch for a SQL server that is having problems or being non-responsive. If that occurs, then we actually have an alert which fires an Azure Automation, which does a health check. It checks the different pieces of it and then sends that to our team, letting us know, hey, there's a problem that was found. Here's what the health state is of all the components are on it. So this is kind of this focus around respond. And then orchestrate is the third big bucket that they use. So this is integrating with Azure, integrating with other third-party systems and things like that. That's where you start to get into things like functions and logic apps and Flow, or now called Power Automate. So as an example, I use Flow or Power Automate or logic apps personally to communicate. I have an API with Nest that I use for the thermostats. And it actually does communication to logic or through logic app to the API, gathers data that it needs, writes that data to the logs that I need it to be put, communicates with a bunch of different things, and it just orchestrates that all together in a graphical runbook type approach. So especially when you're into logic apps and Power Automate, the decisions on when you use things like that is, do they already have something? So is there something pre-built? So as an example, ticketing. And we'll take that low disk space condition I mentioned in the beginning again. If we go back to that, well, most companies don't just want to know that there's a low disk space condition, and they don't want to just send out an alert. They need to generate a ticket. Well, Logic Apps, as an example, has a ServiceNow connector built in, so it'll just create the ticket for you. And again, we'll go back to the hammer and the nail analogy. You could use most of these tools to generate a ticket in ServiceNow, but then again, you're writing your own code, you're maintaining your own code versus using code that's already built. So I know that's kind of long-winded, but it is a complicated question. It really comes back to the key concept of using the tool that was built to do the particular task that you need done versus recreating that tool.
From all of these different automation tools that we've talked about now, which of them is your own favorite and why?
It's a close tie for me between two of them. My original understanding and usage of Azure Automation makes it one of my favorites because we use it for so much at this point in time. But right behind that, I will admit, Logic Apps is really getting a strong place in my heart because it's so easy to be able to do this type of stuff. It's, in Azure Automation, you're writing PowerShell code and testing things out. In Logic Apps, you're doing a drag and drop workflow where you say, I want to go do this. Here's the scheduled time. Here's the task that I'm going to do. And here's the process for it. So I really love Logic Apps as well. And Logic Apps and Flow or /Power Automate are actually built on the same engine. So if you like Logic Apps, you'll also like Power Automate because they feel very similar. So it's, for me, it's a close tie between those two.
So finally now, before we wrap up on the show, is there something you'd like to show us? I know you showed the portal earlier on, showing us the portal to Azure Automation. Is there something else you'd like to show us that is short, a very short brief demo?
Well, let me take a quick look and just see if I can pull up a Logic app for you because I've talked about it, but I haven't shown anything on it yet. So let's see if that will happen. All right, so this is just a simple report example, and let me show you kind of what it looks like. See if we have anything in this one. I didn't pre-prep a demo on this, but so there we go. We got a good example here. So this is a simple Logic app. So we get, and this is literally a drag and drop where I set a recurrence. So how often is it going to happen? What's it going to do? In this case, it's running a query from another Azure service called Log Analytics. So it's running a query out into the environment, and then it's going through each of those different loops. It has a condition identified, and it figures out, oh, okay, hey, if there's a true condition on this, it runs another log, grabs more information, and then it sends an email out with the details that I'm looking for across the board. So this really gives you a quick example to showcase, hey, what does it look like to put together an actual solution in Logic Apps? And it's literally just drag and drop workflows. It's what they call the no-code approach.
All right. So I want to ask, for those listening right now who are new to automation and want to learn about it, what resources would you recommend for those people? Are there resources you'd like to recommend?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost is there's nothing like learning it. So as an example, I'll tell you how I learned most of this. Automation and log analytics and the other components that I use. I have a solar panel at my house, solar array, and I put myself to a task to try to figure out, based on weather, what level of electricity would be generated on my solar array on a daily basis. And then I just started using the tools. So I started using Logic Apps and Power Automate and the Azure Automation components and putting it all together. So I kind of built my own solution that did this. And what I found is just kicking the tires and trying it out, because you can get free Azure credits. If you're learning and everything, they can get free credits on it. That's a great resource, because if you have a task that you're trying to build from, that's, for me, is always the most successful. Right behind that, of course, is I would point to some of the online learning capabilities that are out there. There's some great free online learning, because Microsoft is subsidizing the learning systems that are out there in several areas for Azure. I've actually got a blog post on how to train in Azure. That's on Catapult Systems blogs sites. So if people are interested in that and kind of want to know, hey, how do you get started on all that? We've got a great blog series out there that really covers that topic and helps you to get started and go with it.
Do you mind sharing the URL for your blog?
Oh, certainly. I will go ahead and pop that in the chat window here just a second. It is blogs.catapultsystems.com. And then my name on the right-hand side is the section of my blogs, but there's plenty of other people that do their blogs. And I also put that over into the chat window.
All right. And if the people need to connect with you, do you want to share your Twitter handle? How can people connect with you?
That would be absolutely great. My Twitter is CFullerMVP. So Cameron Fuller MVP. And the joke on that one is that I did that when I started with the MVP stuff. So once they finally drop me, then I can drop Twitter. But I probably will keep Twitter now.
Okay. So I guess because of time, we'll need to call it a wrap here. Cameron, thank you so much for coming on the show today. But just before we wrap up, any last words from you before wrapping up?
Just a thank you. I mean, I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk today. It's so fun to be able to get a chance to meet with people. I mean, we've never met face to face yet, but I know you were friends with several of my friends as well. And it's great to see the technical community and these types of outreaches that's going on. It's truly exciting to me.
so much once again, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. So continue to keep safe, and we're going to do this again next week. So until that time, so we're just saying bye-bye.
Thank you, Kazim.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you very much.